Good. Hello and welcome to our fourth webinar. We're the Saskatoon Youth Climate Committee. I'm Lauren.
I'm Elizabeth.
I'm Natalie.
And I'm Marsha.
This
You can go first.
We are discussing the City of Saskatoon's low emissions plan and the role that Saskatoon can play in climate justice and a sustainable future. So we're joined by some very special guests today. If you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
Well, I can
Go
first, Hilary.
My name is Hilary Carlson. I'm a greenhouse gas control specialist for the City of Saskatoon. So I work in the sustainability division, and I was previously the project manager for the low emissions plan, and now I'm working on kind of related initiatives that are coming out of the plan.
So good afternoon. I'm Sarina Gersher. I'm the City Councillor for Ward 8, and I'm one of the co-leads for the environmental sustainability strategic priority area.
Hi, I'm Mairin Loewen. I'm the City Councillor for Ward 7, and I share that role with Sarina that she already said the hard, long title, so I don't have to. Can I just ask from the people who are here, are y'all from different, so you're from different schools, right? So this is an inter-school committee, great, okay. And what is the grade range in your committee?
Grades 10 to 12. So,
okay, cool.
Well, that's
great.
who's here today. We have other grades,
Sure.
but yeah.
Okay, that's great. That's helpful for us to know, and thanks very much for including us.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I think it'll be a really valuable experience. All right, so whenever you're ready to start your presentation, go for it.
Good. I will just turn off my video while I'm doing this. And, 1 second. Okay, perfect. I just need to minimize all the video. All right, can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I think you guys will have questions for us at the end, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, sounds good. So my presentation should just be about, I think, 15-ish, 20-ish minutes. Usually in person it takes a little bit longer because there's a bit more interaction with the crowd, but these days there's less interaction with the crowd. So jumping into it here, the Low Emissions Community Plan was developed using the work of consultants SSG, or Sustainability Solutions Group, who used an integrated energy, emissions, and financing model in order to demonstrate how the city can reach 80% emissions reduction targets by 2050. So this model that so this model that our contractors prepared for us compared basically different futures. So it looked at sort of a do-nothing business as usual future, and then it also modeled out the emissions for the low emissions community future. So it shows not just the emissions of these two scenarios, but also a financial analysis of the two scenarios, which I think is really valuable. So where this work is kind of coming from is in 2012, the city completed a strategic planning process called Saskatoon Speaks. During this process, we heard the community members and organizations say that the environment matters and they care about the future the next generation, you guys, inherits from us. So using this feedback, the city created the strategic goal of environmental leadership and set targets for waste diversion and greenhouse gas emissions reduction. In 2015, the city signed on to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, committing the city to taking action on climate change through emissions mitigation and reduction activities and adaptation activities, which is kind of the other side of the climate change coin, that prepare our city for the impacts of a change in climate conditions. So jumping into 2017, City Council set emissions reduction targets for both the corporation, which in this situation, corporation means city municipal operations, and the community. So these targets are a 15% reduction to community emissions by 2023 and a 40% reduction to internal city corporate emissions by 2023. And that's just because the city has a bit more control over our own operations and our own buildings and that kind of thing. So our target's a bit more aggressive. And then for 2050, it's an 80% reduction for both groups. So this is aligned with the federal agreement and the Paris Accord. So in 2018, the city reaffirmed its focus on environmental leadership by defining the following objective: the effects of climate change on civic services and infrastructure are proactively addressed. And in 2019, in August of 2019, the low emissions community plan was released for the public. So this is kind of why are we focusing on it now. The science is clear. I kind of don't need to go into a lot of depth for this group. I think climate change is happening and the impacts can't be considered a future problem. Citizens and students and youth are making their voices heard in support of climate action. So it's really important that as a city we start focusing on these issues. So looking at more of a regional context in terms of what's going to happen in Saskatoon if we don't have global action on climate change. So we're not immune to this like anywhere else in the world. In Saskatoon, our climate models predict a 7-degree average temperature increase, resulting in greater weather variability that is warmer, wetter, and wilder. So just a bit more context on what that means. Warmer conditions create opportunities for drought, larger pest populations, and bush and grass fires, which can worsen public health concerns. Wetter conditions will produce more freezing rain and snow, and it could change the timeline in which we receive freezing rain and snow, which would affect our operations of the city quite a bit. And then wilder trends speak to an increase in the likelihood of intense events and emergencies due to storms, wildfires, and flooding. So with these drivers of climate action in mind, the city has this thing called the Climate Action Plan, which is sort of a two-pronged long-term plan in addressing climate change. So there's the Low Emissions Community Plan, which was my project, which I'll talk a bit more heavily about today. And then the Local Actions Plan, which is our climate adaptation plan for our city operations. So both plans are fully available online to the public at saskatoon.ca/climate-change. So a little bit of an overview for those folks that might not know the difference between adaptation and mitigation. So mitigation is referring to reducing our emissions and our carbon footprint as individuals, as a city and a nation. So this includes things like building buildings that are more energy efficient so they waste less energy, using renewable energy instead of natural gas and coal. And the point of mitigation is to reduce the risk of climate change from getting worse than it already is. Adaptation means that we're reacting to climate changes that are already present in our communities and making infrastructure stronger and more capable of handling big storms or flooding and fires. So some of the things where these overlap are, I'm not sure if you guys can see very well, but green infrastructure. So for example, the city recently released the Green Infrastructure Strategy. And something like green infrastructure is about planting more trees, having more natural areas or areas with native plants and trees that are, intended to grow in this area that are naturally occurring in our region. And that they overlap with adaptation and mitigation because green infrastructure can help with stormwater runoff and absorbing different kind of impacts of climate change that way. And then it can also store carbon. So that's where these two things kind of converge, as well as water and energy conservation. So the city also has a strategy coming out that is all about water conservation. So those can be researched more online too, or I'm happy to try and answer questions with them after. So looking at our current performance for emissions, one of the tasks needed to prepare this work was to understand how Saskatoon is currently at. So the sections of emissions shown on the slide help us to determine which opportunities to explore for emissions reductions and basically where we're going to get the most bang for our buck in terms of investing in things. So as you can see, from both a community perspective, buildings and transportation make up a majority of our emissions in the community. So as you can tell, this is a little bit dated info. We're working on providing greenhouse gas inventory reports on an annual basis. And the latest data for 2018 and 2019 should be available in early 2021. So some key changes to note here between 2017 and 2016 was that there was an increase in our emissions citywide, 1%. And the biggest changes in community emissions were an increase in natural gas and electricity usage in residential and commercial buildings. So for city buildings and operations only, our emissions also increased 1% between these 2 years, with the biggest increase being caused by water and wastewater operations, which increased 9% from 2016 to 2017. So in 2017 overall, the city of Saskatoon had 3.7 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for visualization purposes, that's about 715,000 vehicles driving for 1 year. And in order to remove these emissions from the air, we would have to plant 61 million trees, and they'd have to grow for at least 10 years just to capture all the carbon that we emitted in that 1 year. And so if that's still, I doubt this group is, thinking, oh, that's not very much emissions, but if that still doesn't seem like a lot of emissions to you, Saskatoon's emissions per capita, so per person, was approximately 13.6 tons in 2017. So this isn't the most extreme in Canada, but when you compare it to other cities outside of Alberta, it's 1.6 times the average, and the average per capita across Canada, and then 3.4 times the lowest per capita, which is North Vancouver. So getting a little bit more into the low emissions community plan. As I mentioned, we had some really smart consultants with some really fancy software help us model out the different options. So that's where a lot of these like financial future kind of projections are coming from. So like other master plans or strategies, the LEC plan proposes a coordinated strategy which is phased over time in order to best benefit from public input, partnerships, and community and capacity building. So it's important to note that each action in this plan isn't a guarantee. So we have to still undergo further engagement, economic analysis, and actual funding in order to implement these items. So right now it's a strategy, and year by year we have to kind of chip away at the different actions within it in order to ask City Council, for example, for budget to implement these things. My slides are being slow. There we go. Okay. So from a financial perspective, the low emissions community, which is this orange line on this graph here, results in reduced energy costs for the community and the municipality. So in the business as planned, or the kind of do nothing scenario, energy prices are projected to increase steadily, resulting in an average 2% annual energy spending increase. So this is a cumulative increase, for example, when you're paying for power or you're paying for gas in your car, of 131% over the next 30 years. So that means it's going to get more and more expensive to use these fossil fuels in our homes and our vehicles. So with reduced energy consumption and increased uptake in renewable energy technologies, these costs are substantially lower in the low emissions community scenario. And so the plan estimates that in the low emissions community, annual residential energy expenditures, so this is per year, could be $440 million lower than the business as planned scenario. So energy savings are just one component of why it makes sense to proceed with the low emissions actions. Overall, the savings from the plan exceed investments. So the plan is expected to result in a net gain for residents, businesses, and the municipality. So in this graph, for context, the blue lines are all the things, it's basically all the money that we have to invest in things. So this is kind of like the cost of the plan. But then these lines show you all the gains, returns, and savings from the plan. So the red line shows our investment trend over time. So there are a couple of years here where we have to invest in bigger projects, but then over time they pay for themselves more so. So there was a lot of talk about sort of how the plan was going to cost so much, but what really wasn't reported or heavily advertised was that overall the plan actually results in gains and savings and has a positive financial impact on our community. Okay. All right, so there's other benefits to investing in the low emissions community that support other city strategic goals. So for example, capitalizing on renewable energy opportunities provides new revenues to the city to help reduce the reliance on property taxes to operate our city. Investing in electric vehicles for transit or other civic fleet has the potential to minimize maintenance costs over the really long term while providing fuel savings. And with new jobs in sectors like renewable energy, buildings, and clean technology, the LEC plan incentivizes a more diverse and resilient economy. So reducing our combustion of fossil fuels in our community also improves our air quality. This, along with more active lifestyles, so people are, walking, strolling, and biking to places instead of just driving everywhere, and improved water and soil conditions can lead to improved health outcomes. And lastly, each of these benefits leads to a better quality of life through better quality housing, food security, and poverty alleviation. And I think those issues are really top of mind, especially with some of the current events happening today. So looking from purely a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, the results of the low emissions community are kind of represented in this graph. So if we can continue in a business as planned scenario, which is the orange line in this graph, we'll be well above our 2023 target, which is that 15% drop right here, and our 2050 targets. So if we take the actions outlined in the low emissions community plan in the order that they're in, we can meet the targets as shown by this blue line. So something interesting to note is we're kind of too far along already to reach that 15% reduction by 2023, but we can still meet it by 2027, which is 4 years later than the target, so it's pretty close. And then in 2050, with all of the actions implemented, we're projected to meet the 80% reduction target for both the community and the city as a corporation. So the low emissions plan I mentioned earlier, there's 40 actions in total that relate to reducing our emissions. So let's talk about a couple that have a little bit of funding and are kind of in the early stages of being implemented. So first, just an overview. When we think about reducing our emissions, we need to think strategically about doing them in a really specific order. So first, we want to reduce the amount of fuel, water, and electricity and waste we consume. And then we want to improve our systems and behaviors so that programs are basically better for citizens. And then finally, the last step is to switch to the fancy stuff like electric vehicles and renewable energy. And that's just because if we keep building inefficient buildings or we keep having electric cars, I don't think are very inefficient, but basically if we have really inefficient buildings and they're using a lot of energy or wasting a lot, then it's going to require us to have bigger and bigger renewable energy systems. But if we add more insulation to our houses or we upgrade systems first and improve them, then we actually need less energy than we're consuming right now. So it just makes the cost go down and it kind of reduces the amount of resources you have to consume for renewables as well. So getting back to the actions that have a little bit of money to get started on. These are the actions that fall under the reduced category. So one of the big things with this is actually waste. So the curbside organics program means that you wouldn't just, I'm sure lots of you kind of at your houses maybe have seen green bins or maybe your neighbors have green bins. It just means that you separate your food waste instead of throwing it in the garbage. And this is just another tool that we can reduce our emissions in our city. It's not a huge, huge chunk of the pie in terms of our total emissions, but it's definitely a step in the right direction for a lot of other reasons. Businesses and organizations and schools will soon have programs for recycling and organics by the end of 2021. And it's expected that reducing plastic waste, either through bans, I know it's interesting with COVID now because we're sort of forced to use plastic bags and stuff, but hopefully that's soon to be back to normal in terms of using our own renewable sources and stuff for waste. But the city currently isn't actively working on any kind of recycling or plastic bans, just because the federal government is expected to sort of come out with a strategy for that soon. So looking at energy performance contracting, what this means is that the city is doing big renovations to our own buildings, so kind of leading by example first, in order to reduce our own energy consumption. So this means like changing the lights at different pool facilities, the field house, kind of renovating these buildings because they needed a bit of an update. And in addition, there's planned work, including LED streetlight replacement. So this is expected to save almost $850,000 per year once all the lights are replaced, and reduce 4,000 tons of CO2 per year. And then a combined heat and power project at St. Paul's also means that the hospital kind of will use less electricity and natural gas, because they'll have sort of a new system that is more efficient. So there's less wasted energy there. Moving on to some of the improve items. Something that I'm actively involved in and managing this project right now is the PACE financing. So we're kind of workshopping the name a little bit, so you might see the name change soon. But it stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy. So this program is really interesting. It's super popular in the United States. But basically what it is it's a new loan service for property owners. And so this will allow people, anyone that owns a property, for example, to borrow money from the city instead of a bank at a really low interest rate. And the loans have to be used for energy efficiency, so insulation, new windows, or renewable energy like solar panels. So the property owners get to choose what upgrade they do on their home from a list of options, and then they pay that loan back on their property taxes. So this is a really important initiative because a lot of people want to put solar panels on their house, or they even something as simple as changing out their doors so that their house is more airtight and sealed and doesn't let out as much heat in the wintertime. Just don't have the upfront money to do these things because a lot of them are pretty expensive. So this program just provides a new avenue for people to borrow money, and that doesn't affect their personal mortgage rates or their credit rates. Bus rapid transit is also a new type of transit service for Saskatoon. It means that the bus service will be more convenient as certain stops along the network. The bus will come every 10 minutes and passengers won't have to wait as long for their drop-off spot. So this is a really big project, so it's kind of a long-term thing. But the planning for the route network is ongoing, and active transportation ties in with the bus rapid transit system. Its goal is to enable people to move around the city more easily by biking, walking, and strolling instead of driving everywhere. So this plan is also a really big 25-year project. But in the next 3 years until 2022, the goal is to design and construct more bike lanes, improve bicycle crossing lights, and construct sidewalks where there's gaps so it's easier for people to walk. And they don't need to be on busy streets when they're walking, so it's safer as well. So then the last thing in the improved section is the landfill gas capture facility. So the city currently captures landfill gas equivalent to almost 40,000 tons of CO2, and then we actually sell that basically just wasted garbage gas, which that's a great explanation, but we sell 78% of that back to Sask Power to generate electricity. So it's resulted in just under $1 million of revenue for the city thus far. And there's an expansion for the site that has a little bit of funding. So basically that means we can just capture more gas and make more money off of wasted emissions. So for the switch items, the city has these things on the go. The electric bus pilot is expected to start this year and run for 1 full year. So Saskatoon Transit will be monitoring the results to see how a bus performs in all seasons in our Saskatchewan climate, and have also looked to purchase more of these electric buses in the near future. 2 important switch strategies received funding in 2020, including the citywide solar strategy and the community EV strategy. So both these projects are important in order to plan for the use of more renewable energy and electric vehicles in our city. And something that I think people kind of get frustrated with a little bit is that we're doing a lot of studies or we're doing strategies, and we're not just doing the things, like we're buying EVs right away, or we're not just implementing renewable energy. But it's really important at the city, because we're using public money, that we really carefully design and strategize and study these things first, so that when we do go to implement them, they're done well the first time, so that we're not wasting any money. And another thing that has a study happening for it this summer actually is a 1 megawatt solar farm called Parcel M, which is in the really early design phase. So this summer, the city will be studying the area that the farm will go in order to make sure it's the right location before any construction starts. So these are just some small things that you can do as like an individual or a group when addressing climate change. So some of the things you can do are speak to your counselor, your local government. There's a couple elections coming up that I won't speak too much about, but having your voice heard and voting if you're of age is really, really important, as well as leading by example. So whenever people see someone else doing something, it's a really powerful influence, especially in their neighborhoods or someone they trust and respect. That's a really important avenue to kind of sneakily get people to also have sort of the same climate change actions as you. And that sort of ties in as being an ally for action too. So if you hear something cool that's happening at the city, or you're doing something in your own home, just talking about it is really powerful. And I think people don't realize the amount of influence they can have on others just by leading by example. So this is these resources are some more kind of tangible things that people can look at. So one of the things, this is actually Edmonton's website, thechangeforclimate.ca/action. They have all the different actions you can do as a household or at work, as an office, to reduce your emissions. And they've rated them for impact, which I think is super cool. So you can see maybe you have an idea to ride your bike more or to recycle more. You can kind of see on their impact scale how much bang for your buck you're getting in terms of those emissions reductions. And then the Environmental Society, this is a Saskatchewan-based nonprofit. They also have some tips and different options that you can kind of browse through and see that you can do in your home or your office or at school to reduce emissions. I know our homes are kind of everything right now, but someday they won't be. So for more information, you can go to saskatoon.ca/climate change, or you can reach out to the Sustainability Division at climate change at saskatoon.ca. So I usually check this email pretty often. So if you have questions for me or just general questions about what's going on in our division, I'm happy to look at that and answer. Right on. So that pretty much covers my presentation. We can stop sharing screen now. What do you think, Lauren?
There, yeah, and we'll see if I can bring everybody back here with their video turned on. There we go. All right, yeah, thank you so much for that. That was a very, very interesting presentation. Yeah, very, very good introduction, I'd say. So I think we have a couple questions prepared, and I've been writing down questions as we're going, so I don't know who wants to start with those. If we have any volunteers amongst. Let me start.
I'm sorry if you already answered this, but have these plans like been approved? Are they like in place right now, or are they proposals?
Yeah, so they've been presented to City Council already. And City Council basically gave us the go-ahead to carry on working on these things. So the next challenge, I guess, or the next part of the city process was that we kind of pulled specific things out of the plan in the last budget cycle, which usually happens every 2 years in November, and asked for money for these specific things. So some of those things I talked about at the end have little tidbits of funding to get started. So we'll be doing that on the kind of a 2-year rolling cycle, because the next biggest challenge is funding all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know one thing that we're really interested in as a group is the Northeast Swale is being a huge thing we're really involved with. I know, Sarina, that you're on the Swale Watchers and all of that kind of thing. So can you just speak a little bit to how the swale fits into having natural green spaces and like its importance as a natural space in this low emissions plan?
Yeah, so the city actually has, I'll maybe let the councillors jump in after this, but the green strategy, which is like a whole separate strategy that is just about natural spaces and green infrastructure. So I really recommend taking a look at that online. I think it was presented to City Council in February, correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, there's a whole separate project that looks just at that specific area. So it's not super well covered in the low emissions plan just because there's so many different kind of factors to cover. And we knew that strategy was like going to be released really soon. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have more to add on the swale.
I guess I'd throw in a few comments. Have folks been to the swale before? Maybe just a show of hands. I see, yes. I mean, the swale is an incredible place for those of us that have had a chance to go. In total, it's about 26 kilometers and outside city limits too. So it connects to the river at 3 parts. And it's remnant grassland that is still, for the most part, intact and contains rare and endangered species. And so, you know, hundreds of types of plants. We have animals, amphibians, migratory birds. It's a really unique and special place to have in an urban center and to have in our province too, because I don't think this is a surprise for folks, but we don't have as many grasslands existing as we used to. And so there's organizations like Miwasin that have special attention for the swale to help put planning principles in place for its protection, to do resource management like getting sheep at the swale to graze it, to get that biodiversity to thrive, to get to go do controlled burns, which is also really cool to participate in both of those things. And then on the other side, the city has also invested quite a bit of time and money in the swale too, to support some passive recreation opportunities. For example, like a greenway on the outside of the swale. So that greenway kind of acts a bit of a buffer from the development next door in Aspen Ridge and Evergreen and Silver Spring, but also for recreation because there's a trail system in there that also helps manage stormwater events. And then obviously within the swale too, we've got great wetlands that help manage stormwater. And so you can tell I'm quite passionate about the swale. But there's certainly been a few challenges, I think, to let other folks know about why this is such a valuable place from an environmental standpoint, but also just from that green infrastructure standpoint, because it does help with flooding mitigation from the neighboring residents. It manages our stormwater and the water quality that goes directly into the river. And I think that's probably one of the biggest gaps I've noticed come up. We recently had a discussion at council that ended up leading to an increase of speed limits in the swale, which I could probably talk a bit longer about, and was not on the side voting in favor of speed limits, but that's also one of, I think, the interesting parts about municipal government is we all represent 11 different views representing our ward, and so it leads to interesting discussions, but I'd happily answer a bit more information. I can talk a lot on the swale. So if there was something specific that I missed, let me know.
Something else I want to mention about the swale specifically is that the city recently did a natural capital asset valuation. That went to City Council already. And so that's super important because even though it might sound kind of, I don't want to say pointless, but it's really important because it put a financial value and it looked at all the emissions it sequesters and like the stormwater capture and all these different features of this natural area and put a financial value to it. So what that means is that in the future, when a developer or anyone really wants to do something different with that land, they'll have to pay that price, or they'll have to, and it's really, really high, like it's worth a lot of money because
That's good.
it has all these ecosystem services and stuff. So that was a really big, exciting, innovative project that just finished. And I don't know if you've ever heard the term, like what you measure matters kind of thing. But just by putting some accounting metrics and some financial values to, there was another area in the city on the west side. I think it was St. Barber.
Richard St. Barber Baker Afforestation Area.
Yes, I always forget the correct name. But so yeah, that was a really like innovative, exciting project that put a financial value to that area. So that's also another thing that's happened already at the city.
And I just add that it allows us to compare almost, you know, the structural assets like water mains as opposed to wetlands. Like they both have an infrastructure asset and value, and to be able to put the dollars and cents to that is helpful.
Yeah, and yeah, I could probably talk about this for quite a while too. Can you speak a little bit to, so things like the Saskatoon Freeway have been a big concern to us. I delivered a speech to council, well, a letter during school hours, but yeah, so can you just speak a little bit more to that and kind of how it would threaten the swale?
The Saskatoon, oh, Mairin, go for it.
Okay, well, I will start. Sarina is much more knowledgeable than I am on the swale related issues, but I'll take a crack at this. One of the things that we have had some challenges with respect to the Saskatoon Freeway project is that it's a provincial project that the city has. It's not that we have no role to play, but our decision-making space around the project is limited. So for example, the routing itself, like the actual layout of the Saskatoon Freeway project has changed a number of times over the last 10 years. And the city really hasn't had executive decision-making authority over that. So we've tried to emphasize our priorities through that process, but we haven't exactly got what we wanted, to be totally candid in terms of that. Now, the other element that I think is relevant here is that we as a council, and Sarina alluded to this earlier in talking about our recent debate about speed limits, like within our council, although I think everyone would agree that the swale is a really positive asset for the city, there are varying standpoints about the degree to which the city should protect the swale or avoid development that might hinder the swale's future health. And that's probably relevant here. So the city does have membership on a couple of advisory commissions with respect to the Saskatoon Freeway project, but it's not our project. And if it was our project, we might be able to exert a little bit more, well, we would be able to exert more influence about where it goes. And for example, when we did the North Commuter Parkway project, which is now connects to Chief Mistwasis Bridge, we had pretty considerable discussions, set some unique standards in concert with Mairin about, you know, drainage and culverts that would allow for amphibious, what's the word I'm looking for, migratory pathways and those kinds of things to be built into the project. We don't have that kind of decision-making space on the Saskatoon Freeway project. This is not our project. So I'm not trying to make excuses or anything. I just think it's quite complicated because there are a number of players at the table, but we don't get sort of that final say.
Yeah.
So Sarina probably has some nuance to add to this because I'm not as connected to it as she has been, but that would be like the high level view of that project. And I would say I share your concerns. I would also say it's not clear when this is going to be built. And so it's possible there could be some revisions that would have ecological benefits. It's just very difficult to predict because it's not our project. There's been no timeline assigned yet. And so there's a lot of guesswork.
I might just add 2 quick points as well, just to let folks know that the design of the freeway is coming in multiple phases, and the swale Both swales, the small swale and the northeast swale, fall in phase 2. And the province is ready to kick off consultation on phase 2 almost ASAP. I don't know how that looks with COVID and how consultation fits. There is a web page for the Saskatoon Freeway that would keep updates on when those events happen. But my understanding is there will be additional emphasis placed on the swale and looking as best as possible on design parameters that are unique for that area. We've been getting a bit of updates at our Meewasin board meeting from the project lead. And so I'm anticipating getting to see a bit of a charrette design workshop to look through the swales specifically. And I will note that as the city, we've done some different natural area inventories for the swale, and we've shared all of our information with the province as well to make sure that that's available.
I have a question about that. Why, for that project, do they feel that they have to touch the swale at all? Like, I'm sure that it's avoidable. What's their rationale, their justification for like potentially destroying very, very important land?
It's a good question, and it's I don't want to speak on behalf of a project that's not ours, but my understanding is since the swale is 26 kilometers in length, you're already past Clark's Crossing where it wouldn't interfere with the swale, and so that bypassing of the city is quite far, and that economic benefit of building the freeway would not be realized, is what I've what's been explained to me. So I think those are all great questions.
It's just about where the priorities are at. It's great.
I would also say, like, with sometimes the tail can kind of wag the dog on a big land acquisition project like this. So you might have an idea about where you want to put a bridge or a road, but then the people who are willing to sell you land to make it happen might mean that the layout is a little bit different. So I think even in a scenario where the decision makers were really, really committed to avoiding a particular area or choosing a particular layout for infrastructure, like sometimes it just kind of is subject to what you can do with the land that you can get. So that's an additional element of complexity, because like it means that even in a scenario where, okay, the decision makers think this infrastructure is really important, but B, they also really want to avoid the swale, like it could be even difficult to do under those circumstances. So I'm not trying to excuse like a lack of prioritization for the swale, but if I would say that that's potentially a factor too. It's like I'm just not actually sure that the Saskatoon Freeway project is going to proceed in any of our lives, to be totally honest. But it is, I think, important to be asking these questions. It's just not, it's possible there will be further changes before it is implemented.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hopeful that that's the case, because I think there could be improvements made, but we have some limited space on this one. And we, as a council, are negotiating with the province over any number of things, and we need to be strategic about that sometimes.
Yeah.
I actually have a question. Out of curiosity, is the freeway project accounted for in the LEC plan? And if so, what are those figures looking like, and will it increase emissions by a whole bunch or not a lot?
That is not, it's not in the LEC plan at all. So the LEC plan, sorry, I'm shortening it to LEC, was developed it was developed really over 3 years, but we had the modelers doing work for about 6 months. So it's really just a snapshot in time. So things that kind of happened after the fact, we're looking to do some updates to it kind of in few year increments. But right now it's like I don't know if you guys are familiar with like balance sheets, like accounting, like it's just, probably not, but it's just like, it's a snapshot of like that time frame. So we can't, add things in after the fact or kind of see how they would affect things until we do like a full scale update.
Gotcha.
Okay, does anyone else have a next question? we should probably move on to another topic.
Yeah.
Oh.
I have a question. Just with a lot of environmental issues, I find that Indigenous perspective and knowledge can always provide a really interesting viewpoint and a really valuable point too. And so I was wondering if, as city councilors, you've seen ways or see potential to really bridge that gap and to make sure that we're doing both at the same time, because I personally think value can come out of that.
That's an excellent question. I think we don't do a particularly good job of that right now. We are trying to implement a few different ways to, different approaches, I would say, to making decisions that account for factors beyond how much is it going to cost and when are we going to do it. When we consider public policy changes, new programs, those kinds of things. One of those is called a triple bottom line analysis, where we apply an analysis of, social impacts and economic impacts and environmental impacts, and try to integrate an analysis of potential decisions that just goes beyond a fairly, your status quo sort of public policy metrics. And so we have been, I think, where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action intersect with municipal, with city decision making, we try to incorporate that lens into our public policy making. But I would say that, like many other parts of the city, we are very late to this, and that it is really in a fairly early stage in terms of its comprehensiveness and sophistication. So and Hilary might have some additional examples from within the world of sort of LEC specific actions or environmentally specific actions. But generally speaking, we are trying to incorporate our like a more interdisciplinary sort of view within the city, so that we have the people who work in our community relations and with Indigenous relations informing these other projects and working collaboratively. But I would say that we're early in this work, both early and late, if you see what I mean. Like we're just getting started. We probably should be more sophisticated at this than we are now. So it's not really probably a very satisfying answer, but I think it's a really excellent point. I would welcome any other examples that maybe I haven't been thinking about from Sarina and Hilary, because they might have other ideas, but it's a really good point, and something that we're working on making our norm, I think.
I don't know if we've brought any of our environmental projects through our Indigenous Advisory Committee or panel. I know our procurement policy was brought through that lens, and we had quite, I think, valuable feedback that informed our procurement policy. I don't know if we've brought specifically outside of the triple bottom line some of those pieces through.
We do have a project that's not public yet that is going through that advisory group. So it's happening. It's just behind the scenes.
But I do think that's a great point and a great question.
I have another question, if that's okay. Just about the presentation. What are some of the downsides, if any, to these plans?
That's a really good question. The problem with these plans is that they are very, in order to reach emissions targets to 2050, you have to plan out for the next 30 years. And so there's a couple different issues. So one of them is different changes in government. So we have a pretty, I would say we have a pretty young, trendy, city council right now that's pretty progressive. I don't know if young and trendy was the right word, but progressive. So sorry, just look for that one out. So anyways, so our council is like pretty supportive of considering different viewpoints and not just looking at financial implications and really digging deep into issues. But we could have a change in government this fall that is a completely different group, and maybe we have to re-educate on different things and sort of take a couple steps back on projects. So that's just a challenge in general with anything government related, I think. The other thing is that because it's so far reaching, like some individuals are less comfortable committing to certain elements of it. So it's kind of chunked into 4 phases. And understandably so, some individuals are saying, well, I'm not committing to us doing things in 2040 because who knows what 2040 is going to look like, right? So that's also just a general risk with modeling, is that there's a lot of, even with COVID, there's a lot of modeling before the provinces reopened and stuff to see like what their case counts would be and stuff. It's taking a stab at predicting the future, right? So there could be huge technological advancements that this plan didn't see coming, or the opposite. There could be like, things like a pandemic that completely impact our ability to invest in things, right? So that's another problem, is just how far reaching these plans are. They really are just a snapshot in time. And so that's why it's important to sort of keep them updated and to kind of keep public momentum going. But I don't want people to feel like discouraged with climate action because of the pandemic. I think people say you don't want to call it an opportunity, but there is a bit of an opportunity to sort of rethink the way we do things, and we're seeing some of that in current events already. So I think that the pandemic can definitely maybe change the way that we do things as a society in general. So I think there is an opportunity, I hate to use that word, but to sort of get more climate related action in future plans and economic kind of recovery things. Yeah.
To that end, I know we're kind of running short on time, so this is applicable to the last question, but it's also just kind of a generic prompt, which is that I really would encourage all of you to not be shy in reaching out to your city councilor about these issues, because I think Hilary's right, like there will be, and I'm experiencing this already in the feedback that I receive from constituents, that there will be a bit of a push in response to COVID to sort of get back to basics as a council. And what a lot of people mean by that is to shave off anything around the fringes that might be, considered more than water and sewer and paved roads and so forth. So all of these things I think it's a really valuable thing to reach out to your representative and say, these issues matter to me, and to not wait until we're kind of like at a decision point to do that. Because I think, for one thing, counselors love hearing from youth, because it's not all that common. That's not our core feedback demographic. And so we really like hearing from young people. And also, if people reach out and say, like, I want you to keep this in mind, this is really important to me, like, those are the kinds of things that we find really valuable actually in making decisions. At the municipal level, decision making is really closely tied to what constituents feel about a particular issue. And so I think it's really valuable for all of you to just take a moment, and if you've got particular things that are important to you, collectively or individually, to put them on the radar of your representative. And I think that is the risk of the LEC plan, is that it's subject to the political decision making of people in the future who might have very different priorities and perspectives. So in order to keep these things on the top of the to-do list, we need momentum from the community, and obviously leadership from the city too, but that momentum from the community is something that you can really help with.
Yes, definitely. That's a big focus of ours, especially educating youth about their rights and about how they can, I don't want to say apply themselves, but make their voices heard and that, yeah, it can seem kind of scary the first time, but you just have to go on the city's website and you can find your counselor and their email or phone number in 2 minutes, maybe less. I don't know, depends on that. But yeah, I think we're probably gonna try and start wrapping it up. We're starting to run out of time here, but yeah, last few reminders, yeah, like she said before, vote if you can. If you cannot vote, go tell your parents, your relatives, your friends who can. That's just a really important thing, and it's your right as a Canadian. So yeah, and a few people here can vote, which is exciting, but some of us can't yet, so looking forward to that. But
You have more influence on your parents than you think, I think.
yes,
Yeah.
I would definitely recommend that.
Well, I'd
All
also
right.
like to say thank you for creating this space for dialogue and education too. I think it's really exciting and great to see all the work that your committee has put together in a fairly short period of time too. And I know there are other groups of youth that are interested in climate action. Last week I spoke at an Open Door Society presentation on youth voices around environmental issues. And so I'll throw the prompt here that there are other people to connect with. It's easier to do it, I think, as a collective, but kudos to all of you and thank you for creating the space and for inviting us to be here today too.
Yes, thank you for that. And you guys actually have been a big part of the creation of this committee too. You might not know it, but with Off the Grid, yeah, we did a trip to City Council back last year, and yeah, that was a huge inspiration for us. And so I guess I'd like to thank you for that too, at least me personally, getting into trying to community organizing for climate change. So
And
yeah.
from me and Natalie as well. We were both in outdoor school last year, so we spoke with some of you as well.
So yeah, it's really awesome to see people that are voicing things that we care about, who are supporting youth. It's awesome to see so many young women in politics too, and that's really inspiring for us. So yeah, just thank you for everything you do. Thank you so much for joining us here today and taking this time out of your day to speak with us. And yeah, we hope you'll join us next week to our viewers for our next webinar, which will be discussing aquatic invasive species with the Water Security Agency. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Have a good one.